Okay, we're on. So welcome to the Sabbath School live stream, and we're going to wait just a couple minutes until 9:30. But we wanted to have something on so that people who are trying to get connected can get connected and not miss any of it. So in a couple minutes, we'll go ahead and get started. In the meantime, Albert's playing some music for us. He was, and then he stopped. Now he's going to start again. Okay. See if that clock is correct. I don't know. My clock says I've got 2 minutes still. All right. Thank you for that music, Albert. Well, go ahead and finish it out, and then we'll be starting our Sabbath School class. Thank you so much. We already have 8 people on, and of course, some people will watch a little bit later. Sometimes when you're watching from home, it's easy to just sort of sleep in a little bit and watch later. So we hope a lot of people join us. Welcome to the Highland Sabbath School. As you know, regulations and restrictions have made it necessary for us to social distance, not have too many people in a group. And so we're going to be doing a panel discussion for today's Sabbath School, and then we'll have a more normal church service just with no one in the pews. Everybody will be watching online. I think it is important as a church family to do what we can to stay connected at a time when there's so much disconnection. And so we're going to be doing as many things as we can to try to provide opportunities to connect virtually as a church congregation. On Wednesday nights, we're doing prayer meeting through an app called Zoom, and what that allows us to do is interaction. People are going to be interacting back and forth, and so through video conferencing, you can use any device you've got, a phone, even a normal regular telephone. You can even call in. Of course, there won't be any video for that, but we already did that on Wednesday night. We had quite a group of people that came, and so we'll be doing that every Wednesday night. We're talking about maybe doing some more things in the morning through the Zoom, just short connection points. Not sure how that's going to work. I'm hoping, but I can't guarantee, I'm hoping that next week's Sabbath School class will be taught using the Zoom platform, all the different classes like we've done in the past, so you can actually interact, because Sabbath School is supposed to be interactive Bible study time. So just keep abreast of our media to find out. HighlandAdventist.org will have all the details. We're also putting things out on Facebook and sometimes on YouTube as well. so you can keep track of what's happening. This is an opportunity, this is a time when ministry is different, but it's an opportunity to explore new ways of reaching people, isn't it? So we'll be doing that. Pastor Roger and I will be doing some brainstorming this week. If you have suggestions, go ahead and contact us of how we can make our virtual church better. One more thing to mention. As I speak, my computer is uploading a short Sabbath school video for the kids. It's not ideal. I mean, it'd be great if we could have all the kids here, but I hope that if you have kids, you're doing some sort of Sabbath school program with them, either at home right now or maybe in the afternoon when it gets a little bit warmer. The sun's supposed to come out a little bit. But I have just a little introduction. TJ, Fred, and I, my puppets, we did the Bible story from the primary lesson quarterly. And so you can watch that, and I'm hoping to keep that updated quite a bit. So right now it's available on Facebook, on the Highland Facebook page, and it's also available on our YouTube page. When I say right now it might still be uploading. I literally hit the upload button and came in here. So it may be still uploading. You might have to wait just a minute to find that. And then it's not there yet, but I'm hoping to make a website that will be highlandadventist.org/highlandkids or /kids, I guess, and that'll have all of that stuff to help you to interact with your kids, because kids are an important part of Sabbath school. And so we're trying to do our best for that. Seems like there was one other announcement I was going to make, but I'm not remembering it right now. So if I remember it, I'll mention it later. So on our panel today, we have Tad Dresky, Dr. Ludi, Larry Ashcraft, and myself, and we're going to be discussing the Sabbath School lesson, Lesson 12. And in case you're wondering why only guys up here, it's because I picked. Anyway, we're going to look into having this discussion. Tad, would you be willing to open our Sabbath School with a prayer?
I'll be glad to. Father in heaven, thank you for bringing us together in these unusual circumstances that we find ourselves in. We ask that you'll be with those of us here in the sanctuary, as well as those that are watching from a distance. We pray that the overarching theme on all of our hearts is your love and guidance and care for your people throughout history. We ask you to be with us today in your name. Amen.
All right. If you're watching, for those who are watching at home, I encourage you to take a second and go get your Bible. It's really easy when you're sitting at home. It's just a video to just passively interact. But for the spiritual benefit of Sabbath school, as much as you can interact and read along as possible, the better, right? So this one is looking at Daniel chapter 11, and I think we could all agree that's probably been the most controversial chapter, at least in the Adventist church throughout time. And it's a challenging chapter because there's a lot of king of the north, king of the south, and so on, a lot of details. But let's start with reviewing a point I made last week in our Sabbath school class. This is Daniel chapter 10, verse 1. Daniel chapter 10, 11, and 12 are really all one vision. And so, Larry, would you read that for us? Daniel 10, verse 1 gives us the background.
In the 3rd year that Cyrus was emperor of Persia, a message was received to Daniel, who is also called Belteshazzar. The message was true but extremely hard to understand. It was explained to him in a vision.
All right. And now which version are you reading from?
This is today's English version.
Today's English. And Dr. Ludi, you have New King James. Tad, you have?
I have New King James, and I did bring the Clear Word, which is a paraphrase, because that really helps me with this.
More like a commentary sort of thing. And
right.
I have New King James as well. In my version, it ends by saying the message was true. Let's see. It says, but the appointed time was long, and he understood the message and had understanding of the vision. And the reason why I bring that out is because I think one of the reasons why Daniel 11 may be a little bit more difficult than some of the other passages is because Daniel wasn't, in some of these other visions, Daniel was saying, angel, I need you to explain to me what this was. And so the angel explained it. In Daniel 11, he says, I understood it. So, it is still a narrative, so there is still some explanation there. But now going to Daniel 11, we find Daniel set up on a parallel structure, isn't it? So each chapter kind of has the same thing. Dr. Lou, do you want to go through a little bit of explaining how the parallel structure of Daniel sets up?
Yeah, it seems that different visions, they parallel in some way. Daniel 2 vision and the Daniel 7, Daniel 8. Daniel 2, the head of gold of Babylon, continues Daniel 7 with the lion with the eagle's wings. And then when you go down to the chest and arms and Daniel 2, Daniel 7 is lopsided bear, and Daniel 8 is a ram with the lopsided horns. And then we find in Daniel 11, and actually said that those three more kings of Persia. So all those visions and parallel with each other, which helps especially with this in Daniel 11 to go back on the other visions and help to understand and explain them too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it really still follows the same pattern, but in every chapter there's a little bit more detail given, and a little bit different detail. So let's see, Tad, would you be willing to read verses 1 through 4, Daniel 11 verses 1 through 4?
This is the New King James Version. Also in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood up to confirm and strengthen him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all. By his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he has arisen, the kingdom shall be broken up and divided towards the 4 winds of heaven, but not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be uprooted, even for others besides these.
All right, so we see some wording in here that if you're familiar with the rest of Daniel, you'll recognize some key words there. You notice the part about the kingdom being divided into 4 winds? So what does that remind you of?
That reminds us of the Daniel 7, the 4-headed leopard, and the goat with the notable horn, parallels those things.
Mm-hmm. And the goat is in chapter 8, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so we actually, in the Sabbath school lesson, they actually listed off these 3 kings and then the 4th. You've got Cambyses, 530 to 522, False Murtis, 522, Darius the First, 522 to 486, and I believe that's different than the Darius that put Daniel in the lion's den. I believe that's a different guy. And then the 4th king, it says about the 4th king that he would be more powerful, I think, richer and so on. And that would be Xerxes, or called Ahasuerus in the book of Esther. Was he very wealthy? Yeah, you have to put your mic up because no one else can hear you. But so yes, he was very wealthy, wasn't he? In Esther 1 verses 1 through 7, it tells us that the king threw this amazing feast that went for days and days and days. And it was showing off all the wealth and all the glory of the Persian kingdom. It was really kind of the pinnacle there of their power, but it also ended up being kind of the end of their power too. And then, so who is this next king? It says, when he is arisen, verse 3, then a mighty king shall arise who will rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he is arisen, his kingdom will be broken and divided into 4 winds of heaven. Who is that talking about?
Alexander, probably.
Yeah, it's Alexander. So we're switching empires, aren't we, at this point? And this still follows along with what we've seen in Daniel, hasn't it? You've got the head of gold is not really involved in this one at all. The chest and arms of silver, that's Medo-Persia. That's these last 3 and 4 kings, Ahasuerus being the last one of them. And now you have the belly and thighs of brass, which is Greece, yeah. Alexander the Great leading Greece, and then it's divided. So, anybody else have any thoughts on this passage here?
Yeah, this also this divided in 4 parts, actually gives the origin to the 2 kings, the north and south. Eventually, this was divided into 4 generals, and after Alexander unexpectedly died, and too early for his age, and so those 4 generals actually took over, and so that kingdom got divided in 4. And then eventually 2 took over and it actually became the ones of the north and the south.
Mm-hmm.
That's how they came.
Yeah, the story of Alexander is interesting. Very great warrior, very successful, and yet he died, I think he was 33, is that what it was? I remember a couple years ago, it dawned on me, I'm the age that Alexander was when he died. I've not conquered the world yet. Of course, that's not my goal either, but that was kind of a sobering thought to me, Dad?
It was interesting for me to learn or relearn that Alexander the Great, as he's known, also did not have any direct heirs or anyone to carry on his kingdom, which seems unusual, especially during that time.
He's probably too busy traveling to procreate. Now, there's some evidence that he may have had a son that was born right after he died, but if that was the case, that son would have been quickly dispatched, because that's how things worked back then. So let's go ahead and do this comparison here, comparing Daniel 11:2-4 with Daniel 8 verses 3-8, and then 20 and 22. So if we look at Daniel 8. Part of this is we skipped Daniel 8, and there is, because we are having a special program, but there is some really interesting information in Daniel 8 about these kings. So, actually, let's do verses 20 and 20 through 22. Who will read that one for us? Daniel 8, verses 20 through 22.
The ram which you saw having the 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. And as for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power.
What connections do you see with that, with Daniel 11:2-4?
It's 4 wings. They're divided in 4 wings.
You can say something too, Larry?
Just the number 4 certainly jumps out.
Mm-hmm. And you've got 1 king, and then it's divided. Now, what really impressed me, I grew up hearing this a lot. We were involved in church life all growing up. But then I think it was in high school, I had a world history book. And they started talking about the empire of Greece and the Greek culture. And something jumped out at me, and that was, at the time that this was written, Greece was not a thing. There were people living in that area, and there was kind of this cultural thing, but they were independent city-states. They were not connected in any sort of political way. They each ruled themselves. The idea of a Greek empire that, Philip of Macedon brought it together, and then his son Alexander did that. That was years and years in the future. And yet God didn't just say another empire will come. He said the Greeks, he named them. And I said, what in the world? God named them by name. That would have been, I guess it would have been like saying that, somebody saying like Portland and White House and Franklin, Kentucky, and Westmoreland, help me out, there's some other towns, that they're going to unite together and take over the entire continent of North America. I mean, that would be ridiculous to even think of that, right? But that's what God predicted, and that's exactly what happened. Tad?
In my reading, I ran across something that I had not been exposed to before, and that is these passages that we're studying today are some of the most irritating to add to atheists or people that don't believe the Bible's inspired because of what you just said. It's as historically accurate as any history book ever written, but it was written before it happened, and they really have a problem with that, even to the point they try to say, well, this was written after all that happened, and they snuck it in the Bible, which we know is not true, but that should give us a tremendous trust and faith in God, that, like you say, he says specifically what will happen, and even the time frame, when there's nothing there yet anyway. The name's not even there, or it's just amazing.
Yeah, and of course, there's no evidence for this, but you're right. Some people say, oh, well, this had to have been written later. It was written during the time of the Greeks, and then they just backdated it. There's no good evidence for that, but even if it was written during the time of the Greeks, you still have to figure out why the Bible is so clear about how Rome would go down and how it would be divided and all that, right? So that doesn't even help them. If you're going to try to avoid the supernatural in Daniel, the only way to do this is just not read the book, because it's very clear. And no one can argue that it was written after the fall of Rome, because we have documents referring to it that's earlier than that. So let's go on to the next section here. Go ahead.
Before we leave Sunday, there was just something there at the bottom of Sunday's lesson.
Mm-hmm.
And this is probably quite pertinent for where we are right now. Oftentimes we have it portrayed that don't worry, God is in control, God is in control. And I have problems with that personally as we look at a worldwide pandemic, as we look at history and look at World War II, as we look at some of these other global tragedies. To say God is intimately pulling the levers and pushing the buttons, causing all of this, makes him look to be pretty horrible. And how do we balance this attempt of the Bible to give us assurance that in the long run God will prevail? How do we balance that with this idea that God is controlling the minutiae? Because as soon as you say that, then freedom of choice kind of goes out the window. I'm not here this morning because I chose to be here. I'm here because God pushed the go to Sabbath school and sit on the panel button up there, and I didn't have any choice. I don't know if you want to get into all of that, foreknowledge and all, but it's kind of woven in this whole discussion of prophecy. How do we balance that out to where we can gain some assurance by reading these prophecies and to realize that, yes, good will prevail in the end, and yet not be led to the conclusion that everything that occurs is God making it occur, God pulling some lever or pushing some button?
I think that's an important question. Let's spend a little bit of time on that. I'll give just a little side advertisement, you might say, I guess. A couple weeks ago, this isn't the first thing we've dealt with. Just a few weeks ago, we had the tornadoes in Nashville, right? And so right after that, Pastor Roger and I did a radio program for WQKR in which we talked about that very question. What's going on here? Are these acts of God that are causing these things? And so if you're looking for an hour-long discussion on that point, you can go. It's on our Facebook page, and it's also on our YouTube page. So you can look there. It's called Acts of God, and you'll see a picture of Pastor Roger and me and a tornado behind us. That was Photoshopped, by the way. It was not. We did not pose in front of the tornado. So if you want a more detailed discussion, but let's go into that right now. What do you think? Is God responsible for the pandemic we're dealing with right now?
Well, I think Dr. Ludi would be a good one for that. I just volunteered you. But I want to read for those maybe watching, if they don't have the resource in front of them, possibly what Larry was referring to. In our Sabbath school lesson at the bottom of that page, it says God is in ultimate control. And I think that's kind of interesting. Maybe he doesn't predestine or dictate every little thing, but he's in ultimate control that will move the wheel of history according to his divine purpose. And I just thought that was an interesting statement. I believe that's the one you're referring to. Move the wheel of history according to his divine purpose.
Well, of course, just a week or two ago, we were looking at how Cyrus was, would we say, coerced or encouraged by the angel and then by Michael himself to make the decision that he made at the right time. Was that encroachment on his freedom to choose? How do we weigh all that in?
Dr. Ludi?
God created us a free will, and that's the main thing. That's the reason we are in all this situation, because that Lucifer was free to sin if he wanted to. It doesn't look like a God intervenes in every single little detail at all times, but he controls at the end, the whole course of the history. We have many examples in the Bible going either way. Just in very particular situations, God actually intervenes, and like when God Paul, with and that situation when Paul actually converted in there, and situations like that actually God intervened directly in there. But those are few and apart. And then the way they call Abraham, that was a very particular thing. The way he talked about Cyrus, that was a particular thing. But there's some other examples that I got actually called some other people, and people rejected that call. We know that before Ellen White was called, there were 2 people that actually rejected that. So as humans, we still have the freedom. And with respect to the earthquakes and tornadoes and this pandemic right now, all those things are the results of the human acts and the sin, the results of sin. I think God could have saved people from the tornado. He saved my son that was pretty close to the path of the tornado. Why did he say he got saved and the other people didn't? We just don't know. But I think God can save people if he wanted to. So that shows that he's in ultimate control. But I don't think God intervenes from every single little thing in aspect of our lives. We still have our freedom.
And let's go back to the very basis, the very beginning. God could have prevented us from sinning in the first place, right? But if he had done that, that would be taking away our free will. We would have been robots who could not, who would really have no way of really having a relationship with God. In order to love, you have to be able to choose not to love, right? Love is a gift. And so, God is ultimately in control. There's this large mega story arc, so to speak, that ends with Jesus coming. Well, that doesn't end with it, but it includes Jesus coming, and then the millennium and so on, and eventually eternal life on the new earth. But God allows us to make decisions. And a lot of the bad things that happen in this world can come from, there's many sources. We know that God sometimes does things that we might consider bad. They're not bad, but, when the earth swallowed Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, it's hard to interpret that anyway, but that God did that, right? For a point. But that's not the most common. We do know that Satan does some things. Satan and his demons are able to do some things. With Job, for instance. With Job, he attacked Job. God allowed it, but he did the attacking. Then there's also the fact that sometimes we make mistakes, and those have consequences, right? So that'd be our fault. And then the third one, and I think this is the case with what we're dealing with the coronavirus, and by the way, the tornadoes too, is we live in a fallen, sinful world. And so we are facing the consequences of the combined sin of thousands of years of people sinning. It's not because one person did something. It's the combined result of a world that's living in rebellion for so many thousands of years against God's plan. And another thing I think is important to point out when we go to prophecy, sometimes people think that God makes these people do this. Like God said, I'm going to make there be 3 more kings, and I'm going to make Ahasuerus the most wealthy. Then I'm going to set up Alexander to conquer. And that's not necessarily the case. There are times when God sets up people. He was very clear that he set up Nebuchadnezzar, right? And by the way, Nebuchadnezzar was not a perfect person. He did a lot of bad things. But he very clearly said, I have set this guy up to do this for a specific purpose. He was to teach the Israelites a lesson, really. But the fact that God predicts it doesn't mean that God caused it. I use the weather forecaster illustration. If you looked up the weather forecast today, let's assume it's accurate. It's not always, but let's assume it's accurate. Well, guess what? The weather forecaster might know what the high temperature is going to be and when it's going to rain, but they didn't make that happen. They just said it would happen. They had foreknowledge, and God has perfect foreknowledge. So when he's saying to Daniel, look, the king of the north is going to do this, the king of the south is going to do this, and then the king of the north is going to fight back, and so on, back and forth. He's not saying, I'm wanting this to happen, but I'm telling you it's going to happen, but it's okay. You can still trust me. I will still be with you through the fire, through the battles, and so on. I saw a couple people itching to talk, so go ahead.
Well, I've always used the weather illustration as good, and I've always used, probably a lot of us have videotaped maybe a sporting event to watch later, and what do we say? Don't tell us what the score is. And somebody lets it slip. Oh, the Titans won, we'll say. The Titans won 16-0. Well, and then you watch that game. That person that told you that didn't make the Titans win, but they saw the game played out. And God sees everything played out all the way to the end. Doesn't, like you said, mean he's making every detail happen the way to his will. Every detail, because we're involved, sinful people, but he's seen it already, so he can tell us how it's going to go.
Mm-hmm. Larry?
The reason I mentioned this initially is because in situations of grief, sometimes very well-meaning people will come and pat you on the back and say things like, oh, this is God's will is going to prevail in the end. Well, that may be true, but it's very missing the mark of comfort whenever you imply that it was God's will that a loved one lost their life. I'm sure we'll probably lose some people due to this pandemic, people that we know in the community. It misses the mark of giving the comfort that a person might be trying to give. And I guess what I'm trying to say is we need to use this idea, this thought of God being in control very carefully, because it can be misunderstood. I think we've done a fairly good job of describing it right up here, but when you come and put your arm around someone who's grieving and let a phrase slip out like that, they can come up with a very different interpretation of what you're meaning. It can be quite hurtful.
And Mr. Ashcraft, I appreciate you saying that, because as Christians, whether it's right or not, some people do look to us, especially in times of crisis, and expect us to have the answers, and that's a tough answer when someone dies or something tragic happens to someone. You know, the song we sing in church is, "This is our Father's world," right? But then in Scripture, we see that Satan is the prince of this world. And it is confusing to a lot of people. And we probably don't have time today to cover that, but it's a good point to think about, because people are confused. So is this Satan's world? In a way it is. Is this God's world? In a way it is. I guess you could say it's been hijacked, maybe. Might be a good way to put that. And Dr. Ludi, again, I pick on you. It's your profession. How do you, like Mr. Ashcraft was saying, how do you respond to someone that maybe is diagnosed with a terminal illness, and they look to you as a Christian doctor? Why would God do this, let's say? You know, we've all heard that. Can I put you on the spot and ask, you know, what's a good response to that?
Of course, I've been in that situation quite a bit, and to me, there's not a human response to that. And the only thing we can do in a situation like that is just trust that we have a God that loves us over everything, and we have to look towards the future. And the hope of the future is the only thing that's going to make a difference in this world. And if we put things in perspective, when we think that we live in this miserable world, 50, 60, 70, 90 years, you know, whoever is strongest, and when we put that in perspective and against the eternity, what is going to be, you know, that once we get past this, what is going to be 100 years, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, and you say the suffering that we go through in here is not that much. So exercising that faith in God and that hope we have for the future, to me, is the only real consolation we have on the times of suffering.
Yeah, and Romans 8, verse 28 is a passage that's often used in a time like this. I want to read it out of the New International Version because I like the way it put it here. It says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and have been called according to his purpose." It's not saying that all things are good or that all things are God's will, but he's saying I can work within those situations. And I know Heather and I have experienced that many times in our life. One of the most obvious ones was when we had the wildfire that took our house. Now, I don't think that was God's will. It wasn't even a good thing, but God was able to work a lot of good out of it. And we were able to witness to people we would have not been able to. Our ministry was able to be larger because we were suddenly well known in the community as a family that lost their house, you know. And people expected we would leave right away because we had no ties to the area. And when we didn't leave, they said, "Oh, this guy's serious. This guy's serious about his ministry. He's going to stay around even when he doesn't have a place to live," you know. And so God was able to work in those situations for the good. Not that they were good, but he worked in them. So, are we ready to move to the next section of Daniel 11? We're going to run out of time if we don't watch out, but that's all right. Verses 11, Daniel 11, verses 5 through 14. Who will read that for us?
You want to Bible it up since it's so long?
Okay, good idea. My Bible has a paragraph break in between verses 8 and 9.
Okay, I guess I'll take that.
Okay.
If you want. "Also the king of the south shall become strong, as well as one of his princes, and he shall gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion, and at the end of some years they shall join forces. For the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of her authority, and neither he nor his authority shall stand, but she shall be given up with those who brought her, and with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times. But from a branch of her roots one shall arise in his place, who shall come with an army, enter the fortresses of the king of the north, and deal with them and prevail. And he shall also carry their gods captive to Egypt with their princes and their precious articles of silver and gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north.
All right, so we're seeing a transition here. At first, it was very specific. There'll be these three kings, and then there's the fourth, and then another one comes and it's divided. And it was divided in how many sections? We have 4, right? But now we're going to see that 2 of them become prominent. And historically, we know that's the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies having the area down near Egypt, and the Seleucid Empire up farther north. The Seleucid Empire actually probably a little bit more territory, but a lot of times the Ptolemy Empire had more power. And now why just these 2? Well, God is speaking to Daniel about his people. And the battles between these 2 kingdoms happened as these 2 kingdoms are marching to fight with each other. They're marching through Jerusalem. And so throughout this whole time, Israel, Jerusalem, was being bombarded with troops going back and forth and back and forth. At some point, sometimes they would actually go in and occupy Jerusalem as well. Probably the most famous one who did that would be the Antiochus character. And there's a book of the Maccabees, which we don't consider to be scripture, but we consider to be pretty decent history. Tells about how they were able to reconsecrate the temple and stuff through that. When I went to the mission college and took my Daniel and Revelation course, I got a booklet about that thick that covered Daniel 11. And it went through each one of these things, and it showed the historical parallel to each one. It was mind-boggling. Just reading through it was deep. It burned up in that same wildfire, so I don't have it anymore. It was very thick. If we wanted to go into details and do a lot of research, we could go play by play through here. But I think to keep it within the amount of time we've got and within the attention span that we have, I think we kind of point out the fact that this is 2 powers that are vying for influence. One example here is you've got Antiochus II, and he's the grandson of Seleucus I. So they tried to create a union through marriage. That was kind of implied in there. You've got Bernice, who was the one she was the daughter of the Egyptian king Ptolemy II. That was supposed to work, but it didn't work. And in fact, it created more conflict, right? And so God's not saying, I'm going to make these things happen, but he's saying, I want you to have this idea. This play and counterplay is going to be affecting your people throughout this time. So, any other thoughts on this section here? I guess we could go ahead and read 9 through 14 as well, just to cover that passage there.
Reading from the Good News Bible, it has things partitioned up a little differently, kind of mid-sentence, so I'll back up.
Okay.
After several years of peace, the king of Syria invaded Egypt, but he will be forced to retreat. The sons of the king of Syria will prepare for war and gather a large army. One of them will sweep like a flood and attack an enemy fortress. In his anger, the king of Egypt will go to war against the king of Syria and capture his huge army. Verse 12, he will be proud of his victory and the many soldiers he has killed, but he will not continue to be victorious.
Okay. So, and your translation actually just substituted in names, Syria, or the Seleucid area in Egypt. I would agree particularly with the Egypt part, depending on how they continue on with the northern kingdom, because that kind of changes at times throughout here. But yeah. Any other thoughts on this passage?
These 2 kings looks like they're going to repeat throughout the Daniel 11. And some scholars see a difference between the Syrian, the north, king of the north, and Egypt, the king of the south, and believe that the Syrian represents more of the religious type of kingdom, and the Egypt, the south, is more of the secular type of kingdom that is going to go throughout the rest of Daniel 11. And when the Pharaoh responded to Moses, he said, "Who is that God? I don't care about any God. So I'm the God. You see." So it looks like at this Egypt is what is represented as secular power in that time and throughout here and throughout the future. And that actually goes along with the Revelation 17. Goes in there that is actually 3 players, majorly at the end time, and then it looks like it ties up with the 40 and 45 eventually. Revelation 17 shows the Babylon, the beast, and the saints, and it looks like this is pretty much that. Babylon will be the king of the north, and the beast will be the secular powers in the south, and the saints in between. And it looks like those are the 3 major agents that are playing here in Daniel 11. Looks like that's one of the interpretations on that. Those 3 powers.
Okay. And in verse 16, we have a transition point. And now, to be clear, Adventists follow a historicist view of prophecy. And that term is one, I didn't actually learn the term until I was much older, but it's one that you can get an understanding for. There's a preterist understanding of prophecy. That's the idea that all this prophecies happened in the past. We're beyond them now. Futurist prophecy, it's a little bit more complicated, but in general, they're saying all this prophecy happens in the future. I know there's some exceptions to it. Somebody who's a futurist might argue with some details, but in general, they're pushing most of the prophecy to the future till after a supposed secret rapture of the church, and then that happens. So they have these big gaps between stuff they know is in the past and stuff that they think will be in the future. Historicist simply means that we believe that the prophecy began with the time of the prophet or whenever he said it would begin. In some cases, there's a starting point. And it moves forward in history, and so we're in the stream of prophecy, so to speak. And to me, that's the most logical way. The reason I say that is because when I say there's a major transition here, that's because we're looking at this from a historicist perspective. There may be people of different perspectives that would argue that this is a transition, but we're looking at how does this, we're kind of lining up with world history events as it's been happening. And so, verse 16. Well, let me back up to verse 15 for some context. So the king of the north shall come and build a siege mound and take a fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not withstand him. Even his choice troops shall have no strength to resist. Now verse 16, but he who comes against him shall do according to his own will, and no one shall stand against him, and he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his power. Now it's interesting, before it's been saying the king of the north will do this, the king of the south will do this, the king of the north. Now it's just saying he who will come. So that's kind of where we see that transition period. And admittedly, without history to guide us in understanding this, it might be a little bit of a challenge to see that transition. But when you follow in the line of prophecy in the rest of Daniel, you recognize the Greeks end up falling to the Romans. When you look at history, you find that the Greeks ended up falling to the Romans. And so it makes sense that it's transitioning that. Now, the Bible says the name Medo-Persia, it says the name Babylon, it says the name Greece. It never says the name Rome. I believe the reason for that is that Rome had such control over the scriptures during their time that if God had used that, it would have created more reason for Rome to try to suppress the Bible. Whereas Greece and Medo-Persia really didn't have a whole lot of direct control over Holy Scriptures, but Rome really did. And so I think that's why the name Rome. But Rome is also the most clearly described of any of these powers. So we can understand who it was. Yeah, Ted?
Well, I mentioned I brought a paraphrased, the clear word, and it's interesting. Of course, he has license to do this, but the author says, "Then the king of Rome will come with the strength of his kingdom." So he just puts it out there in the paraphrase.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And some of that stuff is up to the interpreter. You know, Larry's version said Egypt and Syria, right? That was not a literal translation. That was an interpretation from the authors. And here, Jack Blanco, in his commentary, is giving that from the historicist perspective. He's just saying it right there, the king of Rome. So,
Could I put one other little footnote?
Sure.
Probably more for people watching, but I ran across this again this week. And like Mr. Ashcraft said, he had to back up because his Bible, the divide was a different place than another translation. But is it correct, and I'll open this up to all of you, that the chapters and verses and divisions are not considered inspired in the Bible? Right.
Yeah, correct, yeah.
So it helps me to be reminded of that from time to time, because sometimes you'll start a chapter and you'll feel like you're lost. It's like, I don't even know what's going on. So it helps to back up, because maybe that first verse of one chapter probably was written to go along with the last verse of the previous chapter. And I just ran across that this week, and I thought that might help someone studying that the divisions were put in by men, not by
Correct.
God. Yeah.
And we're actually going to see that at the end of this lesson if we ever get there, which we may not. But Daniel 12 also is really part of the same vision, but that'll be for next week. So as we go to this transition point, there's a lot of details in there, verses 16 through 28. I don't know if we want to read all that. That's a long passage to sit there and listen to when you're listening on TV. But we do find some specific things, like verse 16. I read that one. You know, he goes and he stands in the glorious land, talking about Israel there. And we also find reference in this to a king who imposes taxes. And let's see, which verse is that? Maybe it'd take longer for me to find these verses than to just read the passage.
20.
Verse 20, yeah. Then there shall arise in its place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom. Within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not with anger or in battle. And in his place shall arise a vile person to whom they will not give honor of royalty, but shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue. Tiberius, Augustus gave the command that all the world should be taxed. That's why Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Tiberius was not actually his son. It was, I forget the relation, but there was a jump there. Tiberius actually lasted longer during New Testament times. You know, Augustus he died pretty early on in the New Testament times, the time of Jesus. But then Tiberius, he was the emperor during most of Jesus' life. His adopted son. He was not a biological son. We adopted him so he would have an heir. So, he was adopted for the purpose of gaining power.
He didn't have a royal lineage, it looks like.
Yeah, in verse 22, as Christians, we can't miss verse 22. With the force of a flood, they shall be swept away from before him and broken, and also the prince of the covenant. So it refers here to the prince of the covenant. Now, I've heard commentaries go into a lot of detail about this. Obviously, we're talking about Jesus here. Personally, I want to be careful how much I bring out of that. There's mostly just a mention there, but it does kind of stake us to the time of Jesus and give us some insight there.
Pastor, if you look back on the parallel things, in Daniel 9, at the time of the legs iron in Daniel 2, and the script beast in Daniel 7. And then Daniel 8, we have the prince of hosts and prince of princes. And in Daniel 9, we have the Messiah the prince, and then it repeats in 11, and in chapter 11, the verse 22, the prince of covenant. So this helps to keep up with the timing of that thing too, in there, with the other prophecies.
That's right. It makes it a lot easier when you realize that the book of Daniel is all as a whole and it's following the same timeline. And that's really how we're able to identify Augustus Caesar and Tiberius. Then we see the Prince of the Covenant there being Jesus.
I even ran across something that said that's like an anchor point in this timeline. You know, it's because even people that aren't familiar with Tiberius and some of these names, it's like, oh, Jesus, you know, the Prince of the Covenant. You know, now I know where we are in things. Yeah,
that does help us. I'm looking at the time. Let's look at verses 29 through 39, where we see another transition. And on your timeline, just so we don't have to spend time afterward, on your timeline, what this is going to do is this is going to be the transition time from pagan Rome to papal Rome. And you'll notice that religious terms become much more important during this time. So Daniel 11, verse 29 through 39. At the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. For ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant to do damage. There's some more religious talking here. And he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. And the forces shall be mustered against him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices. And by the way, sacrifices is italicized throughout Daniel. It's actually the daily. It's referring to the ministry in the temple, which becomes the ministry in heaven at this point, right? Because there's no earthly temple. And place there the abomination of desolation. Remember, Jesus talked about that in Matthew chapter 24. Those who do wickedly against the covenant he shall corrupt with flattery. But the people, let's see, I lost my place there. With flattery. Boy, I really lost my place there. Okay, but the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. I like that passage there. There's all this time when the powers of evil seem to be dominant, but it says the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. And those of the people who understand shall instruct many, yet for many days they shall fall by the sword and flame, and by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue. And some of those who understand shall fall to refine them, purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for appointed time. So, verse 36, then the king shall do accordingly to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished and has been determined, shall be done. He shall regard neither God, the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall exalt himself above all. But in their place he shall honor the God of fortresses, the God which his fathers did not know, and he shall honor with the pleasant things. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, which he shall acknowledge and advance its glory. And he shall cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain. So I'm noticing a lot of similarities here between this passage and chapter 7 and 9. You know, the little horn that comes up in chapter 7, and it speaks great words and pompous words, blasphemous words against the Most High. It exalts itself up to be God, right? Daniel 8 talks about he's taking the place of God at this time. And we can put this on our timeline to say this is the Middle Ages, the medieval time, when a corrupt Christian church took political power. And even though there wasn't one nation, and Rome was divided at this point, they still had this influence throughout. A lot of persecution happened during that time, but also it says that there would be great exploits, right? And I think of the Waldenses and other underground church people who managed, even within this very difficult time, to have to do things for the Lord. Any other thoughts on this section? Okay. So we're going to the very end, and I'm looking at the time, and we have literally 2 minutes to deal with this last section, which is the most controversial part of the entire passage for Adventists. This was not intentional to not allow much time. I will say that there was a great debate historically between James White and Uriah Smith on this. James White held to the idea that the power was the king of the, I'm going to get this wrong, is it the king of the north or the king of the south? That's the one that is in debate here. Y'all remember? I'm not whichever one is the one in debate. Uriah Smith held that was Islam coming up, and he had some great reasons for that. James White held that it was atheism that was rising up, and he had great reasons for that. And they began to dispute very vehemently over it. And Ellen White stepped into the fray, and she didn't say it's this one or that one. She just said, stop arguing. And so we may be able to share some of our opinions if we've got time, but let's keep in mind, let's not make it a point of division here on what that was. We often have a hard time understanding the area that's right where we are, and this would be the area that's right where we are. So, any thoughts here?
I think at the main discussion. Yeah, I think the main discussion in here, this last verses, is whether this is a spiritual thing or it's actually a geographical thing, and this is something we will all have to decide. I read a lot about this, the Adventist scholars now. They go more with the spiritual interpretation of this, and then putting them together, like I say, with the Revelation 17. You know, the king of the north is the Babylon, is the world religion, and the king of the south is the beast, you know, secular power, military, and we are in between. You know, these are the three end times, you know, players in Revelation 17. So a lot of people now believe this is more spiritual. It's not actually a geographical thing to apply.
And the reason for that is because after the cross, the church went from being a physical location, Israel, right, to being a spiritual thing. We are all the church. We're all spiritual Israel. So that's where that interpretation really comes from, to say this is talking about the people of God, not just a specific location.
I guess my final comment would be, I enjoy sailing and boating, and a sailboat, and I came across this, so it's not an original thought, but most sailboats are equipped with a thing called a sea anchor, and it's made for the purpose of if a boat gets caught in a storm, you put it out. It's kind of like a parachute, and it turns the bow into the waves to protect the boat. And I read somebody that compared Daniel and the study of Daniel to that. It helps keep us right, and it helps keep us protected from the waves that we know are going to come by having our minds pointed in the right direction. As we could get caught up in all the discussion and the details and, like you say, argue over points, it's important to know that the overall theme is that God loves us and God is protecting us.
And it's okay if we don't understand every little detail, isn't it? Yeah. So we do need to wrap up here. Our time is over. Let me mention 2 resources for you. If this has whetted your appetite and you really want to know what is the deal with this last part of Daniel 11, 2 resources to offer you that are pretty good. If you want to read the perspective of Uriah Smith, which is a little bit, it's still held by many people, but it has Islam in there and so on. Daniel and the Revelation was his book, and it's very detailed. It's called Daniel and the Revelation. I have a copy of it in my office. If somebody's really burning to have that, let me know. I'll let you borrow it. And giving the other perspective, and by the way, this book is just great it's the clearest, deep explanation of Daniel and Revelation that I know of, is God Cares by Mervyn Maxwell. I have 2 copies of that in my office because I tend to loan that one out, and I don't want to loan out my only copy. So that will give the other perspective that Dr. Ludi was talking about, but it goes into a lot of details of it. Both resources come highly recommended, and they have some great information. So thank you for joining us. We're going to go ahead and cut this broadcast, and you'll see on the YouTube page is another broadcast that is already linked up. You already see the picture there, and that is for our worship service. In just a few minutes at 10:45, we're going to begin our worship service. Please join us online. God bless you. Have a happy Sabbath.